What is the best stat in Fire Emblem? Are offensive stats like strength and magic superior, or is defense or resistance king? While this question can seem subjective, I do think there's a correct answer. However, I think all stats certainly have their own purposes, so in this video, rather than just talking about the best stat, I'll be explaining all the major Fire Emblem stats and how important I find them all to be. And then of course at the end we will be crowning one stat as the best stat in all of Fire Emblem. Let's start with HP, which of course is how much health a unit has. I used to not value this stat very highly, and even now I tend to value offensive stats over defensive ones, but HP is kind of special. The way I like to look at HP is essentially getting a point in resistance and defense, as you can take one more point from either a magic or a physical attack. With the exception of having enough defense or resistance to take no damage, of course, then they're actually superior to HP. Most squishy units that you have to be really careful about have really bad health. Early clerics and mages have bad defense, sure, but more than that, they lack HP scaling that hurts their bulk throughout the game. I don't think HP is the best stat, but I do think it's one of the best. I'm going to couple strength and magic, as in some games they're actually the same stat, and in most games they only impact how much damage a unit can do. Magic might be at its best in Thracia, where it impacts both magic attack and magic defense, and provides status staff or thief staff with guaranteed hit if they have more magic than the opponent. So in the context of that game, magic would probably be valued higher, but generally speaking, magic or strength is just the amount of damage a unit can do with their weapons or magic or whatnot. With this definition, I think these stats are useful, but not one of the best. For one thing, they are undermined by speed, which can double offensive output on its own. Again, I do value offensive stats more, as you need to kill units to progress in chapters. Well, okay, most of the time. So I think they are solid stats I'm happy to see go up, but not the best for sure. Next up is skill. This stat affects hit rates, crit, and skill activations in games with skills in them. Obviously not every Fire Emblem game has skills in them. I'm not as much of an expert on the newer titles, and they tend to have more skills in them that can be activated, so I may be undervaluing this stat when it comes to those games, but in most games, this stat is pretty mediocre. Most games don't really have a huge issue with hit rates, and the player can control this on their own by either using higher hit weapons or using the triangle attack advantages. Skill also becomes pretty redundant after a certain point. Once you have 100 hit against almost every enemy in a game, any more skill is nearly useless. Again, with the exception of skill activations in games where every point is another percentage or half a percentage to skills activating, then it's actually pretty useful even if it goes really high. Sometimes hit rates do matter, like Fire Emblem 6 for example, which is famous for having terrible hit rates, so skill's actually pretty nice. Any game with high stat enemies in the endgame requires decent skill to keep up with natural enemy avoid. I think skill is the stat that changes the most between games, and thus is pretty hard to rank. I don't really value this stat very highly, but again, I tend to play more games without skills in them, so take that with a grain of salt. Even in those games, however, I still don't really think skill is that great of a stat. Let's move on to speed. I absolutely love speed. It's probably my favorite stat and the one I'm most excited to see go up whenever a character levels up, but is it the best stat? Speed affects your avoid and your ability to double. As I mentioned earlier, doubling effectively doubles your offensive output. That's probably pretty obvious by the name doubling, making it stronger than both magic and strength and kind of undermining the usefulness of those stats. Once you get to a speed that allows doubling to the majority of a game, kind of similar to skill, it becomes a little redundant, but every point of speed also gives 2 points of avoid, which gives the stat both an offensive and a defensive component. Now, dodge tanking is not a great strategy in Fire Emblem unless every hit is 0, which is obviously extremely rare, but less attacks hitting means less required healing and more efficiency, which obviously we love. Speed even kind of counts as constitution, as the speed stat is what gets hurt by weapons weighing you down. Again, I love speed. It's the stat I'm most excited to see increase on every level up, and it's definitely one of the best stat, but not the best stat. Next up is luck, which is kind of a weird stat. Luck increases your avoid by 1 and your hit by 1, and also decreases enemy crit by 1. The stat is pretty nice and can make a unit feel way better if they have a ton of it, but hit and avoid are really not that useful, and the fact that they only go up by 1 is pretty minor. It is really important, however, to have at least a little bit of luck, at least enough luck so that enemies that are not using critical enhancing weapons like killer weapons don't have crit against you. It can be really annoying if enemies consistently have 1 to 2% crit against you with like iron weapons, and this can obviously be different depending on the game. I like luck quite a bit. It's not a flashy stat, kind of like skill, but units that have a ton of it will just feel better to use, and units with terrible luck will feel horrible to use, and honestly might just die to a 2% crit at some point during your playthrough. Still, I don't think it's one of the best stats in the game. I'll be combining defense and resistance like I did with magic and strength. These stats prevent either physical or magic damage to a unit. Defense tends to be the more useful stat, as there are almost always more physical attacking enemies than magic ones, but again, this is contextual, as some chapters like Cog of Destiny really want high resistance. It's nice to see a unit get either of these stats, as most units have pretty terrible growths and bases and defense and res, unless you're talking about specific classes like knights or clerics. But I do think HP is more important, and while taking hits is nice, you almost always are more useful with stronger offensive stats. Let's quickly touch on Constitution and Aid. Both these stats are useful, of course, but not as much as the other stats. High Constitution allows you to not get weighed down by heavier weapons, but this will only really matter if you use heavy weapon classes like axes. Constitution is specifically great in Thracia, I keep mentioning Thracia, and we're going to mention it one more time, where it affects what you can capture, but that's unique to that game, of course. In games where you can rescue, Aid affects that. Rescue dropping is great, but it's usually reserved for mounted units to be the most useful, and they already have a lot of base aid just by being mounted. Both stats have their own strengths, but overall are not as important as a lot of the other ones. Finally, we get to the best stat in all of Fire Emblem, in my opinion, of course, and that is, of course, movement. Yes, it's a bit boring as it never goes up naturally, and a big part of Fire Emblem games' fun is watching numbers go up, but it is the stat that affects unit efficiency the most, making it, of course, the best stat. And also, yes, before you mention it in the comments, you can get movement increases in Thracia. This is the last time we're going to be mentioning Thracia. It's probably the most hyped stat increase you can get in any Fire Emblem game, so that's pretty cool. But yes, you can get natural movement increases in that game. Movement impacts how fast you can complete chapters, which even on non-LTC playthroughs makes life way easier for the player. It allows you to get side objectives more easily, like houses, chests, and unit recruits. It also helps you cover up for mistakes like having units out of position. Having Restore and a mounted healer in Fire Emblem 6, for example, allows you to extend with your army way more and still be able to restore the many berserks in the late game. In a game like Fire Emblem 7, with a lot of defend chapters, especially early on, movement is less important, whereas in games like Genealogy of the Holy War, movement is everything, as units with less of it will fall behind and essentially be useless. But either way, even in these two games, even with the context of those two games, and in all of Fire Emblem, movement remains the best stat in all of Fire Emblem, in my opinion, of course.